A millionaire, during a trip, comes across two abandoned babies on the train tracks. With the train approaching, what he decides to do shocks everyone. Alexander Pierce stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, gazing at the cityscape below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the metropolitan landscape he had helped shape over the past decade. His reflection in the glass showed a man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, with steel-grey eyes that had grown cold from years of calculated decisions. The board meeting had just concluded, another successful merger under his belt. Pierce Industries stock would soar tomorrow, adding another billion to the company's value. Yet, as he stood there, the victory felt hollow. "Mr. Pierce?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The investors are waiting in the private dining room at LeBlanc." "Tell them I'm on my way," he responded, his voice carrying the authority that had become his trademark. As he gathered his things, his eyes fell on the single photograph on his desk, a younger version of himself standing beside his father, Robert Pierce, at the groundbreaking ceremony of their first factory. His father's words from that day echoed in his mind, "Control everything or everything will control you." The elevator ride down was silent, save for the soft hum of machinery. In the parking garage, he bypassed his driver, choosing instead to take his own car, a rare moment of independence in his meticulously controlled life. The private dining room at LeBlanc was a testament to excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathered investors, their laughter mixing with the clink of expensive wine glasses. Alexander played his part perfectly, the successful CEO, the calculated risk-taker, the man who had everything under control. "To Pierce Industries," someone toasted, "and to Alexander, who's proven once again why he's the best in the business." He raised his glass, a practiced smile on his face, but his mind was elsewhere. Looking around the table, he realized he knew everything about these people's portfolios, but nothing about their lives. They were all players in the same game, moving. Pieces on a board where profit was the only measure of success. The dinner dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. When he finally excused himself, citing an early morning meeting, no one questioned it. They never did. Instead of heading home, Alexander found himself taking an unfamiliar route through the city's older districts. The streets here were narrower, the buildings shorter, the air somehow different from the sterile environment of his usual haunts. He passed small family restaurants where people sat together, talking and laughing. Through apartment windows, he caught glimpses of real lives being lived. Children playing, couples cooking together, elderly neighbors chatting on adjacent balconies. His car's GPS chirped, trying to redirect him back to his usual route, but he ignored it. For the first time in years, he was driving without a destination, without a plan. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The neighborhood grew increasingly industrial. Old warehouses loomed on either side, their brick facades telling stories of a bygone era. A train whistle sounded in the distance, its mournful cry echoing off the empty buildings. As he approached a railroad crossing, the warning lights began to flash and the barriers started to lower. He slowed to a stop, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, his mind still processing the strange emptiness he'd felt at dinner. That's when he saw them, two small bundles on the tracks, illuminated by his headlights. At first, his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. Then one of the bundles moved. The train whistle sounded again, closer this time. In that moment, Alexander Pierce, the man who had spent his entire life maintaining perfect control, did something completely unplanned. He acted on pure instinct. He was out of his car before he could think, his expensive shoes hitting the gravel. As he ran toward the tracks, the sound of the approaching train grew louder, its headlight now visible in the distance, casting long shadows ahead of it. The barriers were fully lowered now, but he ducked under them without hesitation. As he got closer, he could hear it, the unmistakable sound of babies crying. Time seemed to slow as Alexander reached the tracks. The twins were wrapped in matching blue blankets, their tiny faces red from crying. Without thinking, he scooped them up, one in each arm, and sprinted back toward safety. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the train bore down on them, its horn blaring in warning. He cleared the tracks just seconds before the train thundered past, the rush of air tousling his perfectly styled hair. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The babies, perhaps sensing they were safe, had quieted to soft whimpers. As the train passed, its rhythmic clacking fading into the distance, Alexander heard something else, a weak cry for help. Following the sound, he found her lying near a cluster of old railroad ties, barely conscious. She was young, probably, in her early 30s, with dark hair and clothes that had once been neat, but were now dusty and torn. "The babies," she whispered, trying to reach out. "My babies." "They're safe," he assured her, kneeling beside her while carefully cradling the twins. "But you need help. I'm calling an ambulance." She tried to speak again, but lost consciousness. Alexander balanced the twins in one arm while pulling out his phone with his free hand. Within minutes, the quiet industrial area was filled with the wail of sirens and the flash of emergency lights. The paramedics worked quickly, loading the unconscious woman into the ambulance. When they asked about the babies, Alexander found himself saying, "I'm going with them." It wasn't a decision he had consciously made, but something in him couldn't bear to let them go. The hospital was a stark contrast to the luxurious environments he usually frequented. The emergency room was crowded, the chairs filled with people from all walks of life. Alexander sat there, still holding the twins, his $1,000 suit wrinkled, his Italian leather shoes scuffed from the gravel. A social worker appeared, asking questions he couldn't answer. Who was the woman? What had happened? Were the babies hurt? All he could tell them was where he had found them. Hours passed. The twins were examined and declared healthy, though dehydrated. They were estimated to be about 6 months old, a boy and a girl. Alexander stayed, making calls to reschedule his morning meetings, something he had never done before. Finally, a doctor emerged to update them on the woman's condition. She was stable but had suffered a concussion and various injuries. What caught everyone's attention was the doctor's next statement. These weren't injuries from a fall. Someone pushed her. The social worker's expression darkened. "I'll contact the police." Alexander found himself walking to the woman's room, drawn by something he couldn't explain. She was awake now, though groggy. The twins, who had been returned to her room, were sleeping peacefully in a hospital crib. "Thank you," she said softly when she saw him. "You saved our lives." "What happened?" he asked, pulling a chair closer to her bed. "Who did this to you?" She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. I can't." "You're safe now," he assured her, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "I'm Alexander Pierce." "Whatever. You need protection, legal help, anything, I can provide it." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she spoke. "I'm Emma Thompson. I used to be a teacher before." She glanced at the sleeping twins. "Before everything changed." As she began to tell her story, Alexander felt something shift inside him. This woman wasn't a business opportunity or a problem to be solved. She was someone who needed help, real help, not just money thrown at a situation. "I've tried everything," she continued, her voice breaking. "Every shelter, every charity, but with twins, there's never enough room, and he always finds us." "Who finds you?" Emma's hands twisted in the hospital blanket. "My ex-husband. He's not what people think he is. On the outside, he's charming, successful, but behind closed doors." Alexander leaned forward, his business instincts recognizing there was more to this story than a simple case of domestic troubles. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start from the beginning." Emma's story unfolded like a carefully constructed house of cards collapsing. She spoke of her ex-husband, James Morrison, a real estate developer known for his charitable donations and public speaking engagements about corporate responsibility, the same man who, behind closed doors, had systematically isolated her from friends and family, controlling every aspect of her life. "When I discovered I was pregnant with twins," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I thought things would change. James had always talked about wanting children." She paused, closing her eyes briefly. Instead, he became obsessed with controlling every detail of the pregnancy, which doctors I could see, what I could eat, where I could go. He even quit his job to take care of me. Alexander listened intently, his mind cataloging details with the same precision he usually reserved for business deals. But this was different. For the first time in years, he wasn't analyzing information for profit. He was trying to understand someone's pain. After the twins were born, Emma continued, things got worse. He wouldn't let anyone visit, not even my sister. He installed cameras throughout the house, claiming it was for security. Then I found documents on his computer, plans for the twins' future, all mapped out in disturbing detail. Private schools, career paths, even potential marriage partners, all selected before they could even walk. The twins stirred in their hospital crib, and Emma's eyes darted to them protectively. Alexander noticed how her whole body tensed at any sound from the hallway, her eyes constantly checking the door. 3 weeks ago, I overheard him on the phone, she said, her voice shaking. He was talking about some kind of trust fund for the twins, but it wasn't normal. He was discussing contingency plans if I became problematic. That's when I knew I had to leave. Alexander's phone buzzed, another missed call from the office. He silenced it without looking. How did you end up by the railroad tracks? Emma's hands twisted in the hospital blanket. I thought I had planned everything carefully. I waited until he was at a charity event, packed a small bag with essentials for the twins. I had some money saved. I'd been tucking away small amounts from the grocery allowance he gave me, but somehow he knew. He must have been tracking my phone. She took a shuddering breath. I was trying to get to the women's shelter across town. I thought I'd lost him, but then I saw his car. I ran into the industrial district, hoping to lose him in the maze of old warehouses. That's when he caught up to me. Alexander felt his jaw tighten. He pushed you. Emma nodded slowly. I managed to set the twins down before he reached me. The last thing I remember is falling, and then nothing until I heard your voice. A knock at the door made them both jump. A nurse entered, checking Emma's vital signs and adjusting her IV. Alexander used the interruption to process what he'd heard. James Morrison, he knew the name. Their paths had crossed at various charity functions and business events. The man had always struck him as somewhat artificial, but Alexander had dismissed it as typical networking behavior. After the nurse left, Emma spoke again, her voice stronger. I know how this sounds. James is respected in the community. He has connections with the police, the media, even the judicial system through his charitable work. Nobody would believe me over him. Alexander stood, walking to the window. The city sprawled before them, its lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. In the reflection of the glass, he could see Emma with the twins, her face etched with worry despite her obvious exhaustion. I believe you, he said quietly, turning back to face her. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. In his world of corporate takeovers and power plays, trust was a commodity rarely given, but something about Emma's story rang with an authenticity he couldn't ignore. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Why? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. Alexander's response surprised them both. Because I recognize the look in your eyes. It's the same look I see in the mirror every morning. Someone trapped in a cage built by someone else's expectations. The next morning brought a flurry, gave activity to Emma's hospital room. Social workers, police officers, and hospital administrators all wanted statements and explanations. Alexander watched as Emma repeated her story, each retelling leaving her more drained. He noticed how she carefully omitted certain details, particularly about James's business connections. Between interviews, Alexander made calls of his own. His assistant was bewildered by his requests: secure apartment listings, private security services, and most surprisingly, recommendations for nanny agencies specializing in infant care. Sir, his assistant ventured. The board meeting with Japanese investors. Reschedule it, Alexander interrupted, watching as one of the twins, the boy he'd learned was named Lucas, gripped his finger with surprising strength. The girl, Lily, was sleeping peacefully in the hospital crib, "But sir, your father specifically arranged—" I said reschedule it. His tone was firm, but lacking its usual edge. He ended the call and turned back to Emma, who was speaking with a police detective. "Mrs. Morrison," the detective was saying, "without concrete evidence of assault." "Ms. Thompson," Emma corrected firmly. "I never took his name. And I understand how this works, detective. James will have an alibi, probably several prominent people willing to swear he was with them at some charity function when this happened." The detective shifted uncomfortably. "We'll investigate your claims, but nothing will come of it," Alexander finished, stepping forward. "Because Mr. Morrison's charitable foundation happens to be a major donor to the Police Benevolent Association. Isn't that right, detective?" The officer's face reddened. "Mr. Pierce, I assure you our investigation will be thorough and unbiased." "Oh, of course it will." Alexander's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And I'm sure you'll be equally thorough in investigating the surveillance footage from the warehouse district. My security team is retrieving it as we speak." The detective's expression changed subtly. "I wasn't aware private security had jurisdiction." "They don't. But they do have excellent cameras on several buildings I own in that area. Installed last month, actually. High resolution, night vision capable." It was a bluff. He owned no such buildings, but the detective didn't know that. After the detective left, Emma turned to Alexander. "There aren't really any cameras, are there?" "No," he admitted. "But he'll waste time looking for them, which gives us time to get you and the twins somewhere safe." "Us?" Emma's voice was cautious. "Mr. Pierce." "Alexander," he corrected. "And yes, us, I'm not walking away from this situation." She studied him with tired eyes. "Why? You've already done more than enough. You saved us. You don't owe us anything else." Alexander found himself struggling to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "Maybe I'm not doing this for you. Maybe—" He paused, looking at the twins. "Maybe I'm doing it for myself." Before Emma could respond, a nurse entered with discharge papers. "Ms. Thompson, you're being released, but you'll need someone to stay with you for at least 48 hours due to the concussion." "She'll be staying at my guest house," Alexander said firmly, "with full-time medical supervision." Emma started to protest, but Alexander held up his hand. "It's the safest option. James won't expect it, and it's a secure property with its own gate and security system." "I can't accept," Emma began. "You can, and you will," Alexander interrupted, his voice gentle, but firm. "At least until we figure out a long-term solution. The twins need a safe place to sleep tonight." As if on cue, Lily woke up and began to fuss. Emma reached for her, wincing at the movement. Without thinking, Alexander picked up the baby, cradling her with surprising naturalness. Lily's cries softened to curious coos as she stared up at him. "Well," Emma said softly, watching them, "it seems at least one of us trusts you completely." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander felt something warm spread through his chest. Looking down at Lily's tiny face, he made a silent promise. To her, to Lucas, to Emma, and somehow to himself. He would protect them, not because he had to, not because it was expected, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted to do something simply because it was right. The guest house on Alexander's estate was larger than any home Emma had ever lived in. Located at the far end of the manicured grounds, it offered both privacy and security. As they pulled up to the gate in Alexander's car, Emma clutched the twins' diaper bag, still struggling to process the sudden turn her life had taken. "The security code changes every 12 hours, Alexander explained as they entered. "Only you and I will have access to the new codes." He led them through a spacious living room furnished in subtle earth tones. "The medical staff will stay in the adjacent cottage, but they'll only enter when you call them." Emma absorbed the details with overwhelmed silence. Lucas and Lily, however, seemed perfectly at ease, their eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings from their car seats. "There's a nursery upstairs," Alexander continued, his voice softening. "I had it prepared while you were in the hospital. The furniture was delivered this morning. Everything's new, never used." Emma finally found her voice. "How did you manage all this so quickly?" "Money has its uses," he replied simply. Then, noticing her discomfort, he added, "Consider it an investment in doing something worthwhile for once." As they settled in, Alexander's phone buzzed continuously. He ignored most calls, but one made him pause, his father's name flashing on the screen. "I should take this," he said, stepping onto the guest house's terrace. "Alexander," his father's voice was cold. "Would you care to explain why you cancelled the meeting with the Japanese investors?" Something more important came up. More important? Robert Pierce's laugh was harsh. Than a $100 million deal? Than the reputation of this company? Alexander watched through the window as Emma carefully lifted Lily from her car seat, speaking softly to her daughter. The baby's tiny hand reached up to touch her mother's face. "Yes," he said simply. "More important." "The board is meeting tomorrow morning," his father continued as if he hadn't spoken. "They're concerned about your recent behavior. Missed meetings. Cancelled appointments. This isn't like you, Alexander. Maybe that's not a bad thing. What's that supposed to mean?" Alexander thought about Emma's story, about James Morrison's perfectly crafted public image hiding something sinister. How many other facades was he living among? "It means I'm making my own decisions for once." "Is this about that woman?" His father's voice turned sharp. "Yes, I know all about your little rescue mission. James Morrison called me this morning. He's worried sick about his wife and children." Alexander's grip tightened on his phone. "Ex-wife, and she's not going back to him." "Don't be naive. Morrison is a respected member of the community. If you get involved in their domestic disputes, it could damage everything we've built." "Everything you've built," Alexander corrected. "And maybe it needs some damaging." He ended the call before his father could respond, something he'd never dared to do before. When he turned around, Emma was standing in the doorway, her face pale. "James called your father. He's trying to maintain control," Alexander said, "but he won't find you here. This property isn't listed under my name or the company's, it's held by a private trust." Emma wrapped her arms around herself. "I'm disrupting your entire life." "No," Alexander said, surprising himself with his certainty. "You're showing me what I've been missing from it." Inside, a baby's cry broke the tension. As they walked back, Alexander's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his assistant. The board was calling an emergency meeting. Several major shareholders were expressing concerns. His father's influence was already at work, but watching Emma tend to the twins, seeing the peace in her face as she held them close, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Later that evening, after ensuring Emma and the twins were settled, Alexander drove home to his empty penthouse. The city lights sparkled below, just as they had countless nights before, but something had changed. The victory drinks, the business, deals, the endless pursuit of more. It all seemed hollow now. He walked to his home office and opened his laptop. Time to see exactly what kind of man James Morrison really was. If he was going to protect Emma and the twins, he needed ammunition, the kind that even Morrison's carefully crafted public image couldn't withstand. The morning sun filtered through the boardroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Alexander sat at his usual place, but everything else felt different. The familiar faces of board members now held unfamiliar expressions, concern, disapproval, even barely concealed hostility. His father sat opposite him, impeccable as always in a custom-made suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. But it was the man next to his father that made Alexander's blood run cold. James Morrison, looking every bit the concerned husband in an expertly tailored navy suit. "We're here," the board chairman began, "to address some concerning developments regarding the leadership of Pierce Industries." Alexander maintained his composure, even as he noticed several board members avoiding his gaze. His father had been busy, no doubt sharing carefully selected information about his son's recent erratic behavior. "Mr. Morrison," the chairman continued, "has brought some serious allegations to our attention. Given his standing in the community and his long-standing relationship with Pierce Industries, we felt it warranted immediate discussion." James Morrison stood, his expression a perfect mask of concern. "I hate to be here under these circumstances," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "Alexander has always been someone I respected, but when he helped my mentally unstable ex-wife kidnap our children—" "That's a lie." Alexander's voice cut through the room like a blade. "And you know it." "We have police reports," Morrison continued, sliding folders across the table. "Documentation of Emma's increasingly paranoid behavior, her history of making unfounded accusations, the restraining order I was forced to file." Alexander opened the folder. The documents looked official, complete with police letterheads and timestamps. All carefully fabricated, he was certain, but proving it would be another matter. "The board's concern," his father interjected, "is not just about this personal matter. Alexander has been making questionable decisions lately, cancelling crucial meetings, neglecting important clients." "To prevent a woman and her children from being harmed," Alexander finished. "Yes, I made that choice, and I'd make it again." The chairman cleared his throat. "Alexander, your recent actions have caused several major shareholders to express serious concerns. The company's stock has already dropped 3 points since news of your involvement in this situation became public." Alexander looked around the table, seeing the decision already made in their eyes. His father had orchestrated this perfectly, using Morrison's allegations to paint a picture of a CEO losing his grip, prioritizing personal crusades over shareholder value. "We're suggesting," the chairman continued, "a temporary leave of absence. Give yourself time to sort out these personal matters. While the board reviews your position," his father added, the threat clear in his voice. Alexander sat back in his chair, a strange calm settling over him. He thought of Emma, and the twins safe in his guest house, of the fear in her eyes when she spoke of Morrison, and the trust she'd placed in him despite everything. "No need for a review," he said quietly. "I resign." The room erupted in murmurs. His father's face darkened with fury. "Don't be foolish," Robert Pierce hissed. "Everything you've worked for." "Was it worth it?" Alexander asked, standing. "Building all this, maintaining control at any cost?" He looked directly at his father. "Did it fill the emptiness after Mom left?" The color drained from his father's face. It was an unspoken rule in their family, never mention his mother's departure. But Alexander was done with silence. "You taught me that control was everything," he continued. "That vulnerability was weakness, that trust was for fools." He gathered his papers slowly. "It took meeting someone who lost everything but kept her humanity to show me how wrong you were." Morrison stood, his mask slipping slightly. "You're making a mistake, Pierce. You don't want me as an enemy." Alexander smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. "Actually, James, I do. Because unlike everyone else in your life, I'm not afraid of you." He walked to the door, then turned for one final look at the room where he'd spent so many hours, chasing his father's approval. "I'll have my resignation letter on your desk within the hour. And James," he paused, "the cameras in the warehouse district, they do exist, and I have the footage." It was a bluff, but watching Morrison's face pale slightly made it worth it. Let him wonder. Let him question every shadow, just as he'd made Emma do. As the elevator carried him down from the executive floor, Alexander felt lighter than he had in years. He'd lost his company, his father's approval, his carefully constructed world of control and power. But for the first time in his adult life, he was free. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "The twins rolled over for the first time today. Wish you'd been here to see it." Alexander smiled, realizing that somehow in losing everything he thought mattered, he'd found something that truly did. Alexander's penthouse felt different now. The sleek furniture and modern art that had once symbolized his success now seemed like artifacts from another life. He moved through the space, packing essential items into a leather duffel bag. The morning news played on the television in the background, the financial channel reporting on his sudden resignation from Pierce Industries. In a shocking development, Alexander Pierce, CEO of Pierce Industries, has stepped down from his position. Sources close to the board suggest growing concerns about Pierce's recent behavior and decision-making. The company's stock has experienced significant volatility. He turned off the TV, letting silence fill the room. His phone had been buzzing non-stop with calls from journalists, business associates, and supposed friends. He ignored them all, responding only to messages from Emma and his private security team. A knock at the door made him pause. Through the security camera, he saw his sister, Catherine, standing in the hallway. He hadn't spoken to her in months. Their father's influence had driven a wedge between them years ago. "You look terrible," she said when he opened the door. Her smile was gentle, reminiscent of their mother's. "Thanks," he replied dryly, letting her in. "I assume father sent you to talk sense into me." Catherine walked to the window, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors. "Actually, I came on my own. I saw the news." She turned to face him. "Is it true? Did you really give it all up for a woman and her children?" "It's not that simple." "It never is." She picked up a framed photo from his desk, the two of them as children before their mother left, before their father's obsession with control had poisoned everything. "Tell me about her." Alexander found himself sharing Emma's story, watching his sister's expression shift from curiosity to concern to determination. "James Morrison," Catherine said when he finished. "I know him from the charity circuit. Always perfectly polished, perfectly generous, perfectly fake." "You noticed too?" "Women usually do." She set down her purse and began opening cabinets in his kitchen. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't from a restaurant?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "The twins are asking for Lex. They miss their story time." A smile tugged at his lips. He'd started reading to the twins every evening, a routine that had become the highlight of his days. Lucas would fall asleep almost immediately, but Lily would stay awake, her tiny hand gripping his finger as he read. Catherine watched him, her expression softening. "I haven't seen you smile like that since we were kids." "I'm learning to be human again," he admitted. "Good," she pulled out her phone. "Now, about Morrison, I might have some information that could help." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What kind of information?" "Let's just say not all of his charitable contributions have been entirely charitable." She showed him some documents on her phone. "I've been doing some digging since I heard about your resignation. His foundation's finances are creative." "How did you get this?" "I may have maintained some connections at the bank where I used to work." She smiled. "Being underestimated has its advantages. No one suspects the socialite who arranges charity galas of understanding financial forensics." Alexander studied the documents carefully. The numbers told a story of money laundering and tax evasion, all hidden behind a veneer of philanthropic work. "This could ruin him," he said slowly. "Yes, but we need more proof." "And—" Catherine hesitated. "He'll know it came from me. I'll lose my position on several charitable boards." "Kathy, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." She touched his arm gently. "Mom would be proud of you, you know, for finally breaking free, for helping someone who needed it." She straightened her shoulders. "Let me help too." Alexander hugged his sister, realizing how much he'd missed her. When they pulled apart, she wiped her eyes quickly and returned to her practical self. "Now about your living situation. That penthouse you bought last year under an LLC, the one father doesn't know about. Is it ready?" "Yes, but—" "Move. There tonight. Morrison will be watching this place." She began making notes on her phone. "I'll have my security team sweep it first." "And Alexander?" She looked up at him. "Bring them with you. Emma and the twins. The guest house is too obvious." "It's not that simple. Emma's still recovering. The twins need routine. And they need to be safe." Catherine's voice was firm. "Morrison's not going to give up easily, not when his perfect facade is at risk. The penthouse has better security, and you'll be there to protect them." Alexander thought about it. The other penthouse was in a different part of the city, with state-of-the-art security and a private elevator. More importantly, it was completely disconnected from Pierce Industries and his father's influence. His phone buzzed again, another message from Emma. "Lily won't sleep. She keeps looking at the door around story time." Catherine read the message over his shoulder and smiled. "Well, big brother, looks like you have somewhere to be. Go. I'll handle things here and send you the rest of what I found on Morrison." As he drove to the guest house that evening, Alexander reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few days. He'd lost his company, his father's approval, and his carefully constructed world of power and control. But somehow he'd regained his sister, his humanity, and something he'd never expected, a chance to be part of a real family. Emma noticed the change in Alexander the moment he arrived for story time. There was a tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She waited until the twins were asleep, their tiny forms peaceful in their cribs, before confronting him. "Something's wrong," she said softly, leading him to the living room. "What happened?" Alexander hesitated, then told her about the board, meeting, his resignation, and Catherine's discoveries about Morrison's foundation. Emma listened without interrupting, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You gave up everything," she whispered when he finished. "Your company, your position." "No," he corrected gently. "I gave up an illusion. Everything I thought was important, the power, the control, the endless pursuit of more. It was all empty." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Emma, for the first time in my life, I'm doing something real, something that matters." A noise from outside made them both tense. It was just the wind in the trees, but Emma's fear was visible. "James won't stop," she said, voicing what they both knew. "Now that you've challenged him publicly, he'll be even more determined." "That's why we need to move," Alexander explained. Catherine's suggestion about the other penthouse. "It's secure, private, and completely off Morrison's radar." Emma stood, walking to the twins' room. She watched them sleep for a long moment before speaking. "When I first met James, he was charming, successful, passionate about his charitable work. Everyone admired him. I thought I was so lucky." She turned to Alexander. "But there were signs, small things at first, checking my phone, questioning my friends, suggesting I quit my teaching job because he could take care of me." "Emma, I'm not—" "I know," she interrupted softly. "You're nothing like him. That's what scares me sometimes. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this all to be another elaborate trap. But then I see you with the twins, how gentle you are with them, how you never try to control or demand anything." A soft cry from Lily interrupted them. Before Emma could move, Alexander was already heading to the nursery. She watched as he gently lifted the baby, speaking to her in soft tones. Lily immediately calmed, her tiny hand gripping his tie. "See," Emma said, watching them. "She trusts you completely. Maybe it's time I did too." Alexander looked up, still cradling Lily. "Whatever happens, I promise you this. You and the twins will always be free to make your own choices. I'm not here to control your life, Emma. I'm here to help you live it on your terms." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, Lily cooed softly, reaching for her mother. Emma took her, and for a moment they stood together, a tableau of what might be possible. "Okay," Emma said finally, "we'll move to the penthouse. But, Alexander," she met his eyes, "I need to know everything. No protecting me from the truth. No making decisions about our safety without consulting me. I've had enough of men thinking they know what's best for me." "Agreed," Alexander nodded. "Complete honesty, always." Later that night, after finalizing plans for the move, Alexander received a text from Catherine. "Morrison's been making calls. Lots of them. Something's coming, be careful." He looked out at the darkened grounds of his estate, knowing that somewhere out there, James Morrison was plotting his next move. But this time, Alexander wasn't fighting for control or power or his father's approval. He was fighting for something far more precious, the chance to be part of a real family, to protect people who trusted him not because of his name or position, but because of who he was choosing to become. In the nursery, Lucas stirred and whimpered. Alexander went to him automatically, the action now as natural as breathing. As he settled the baby boy back to sleep, he made a silent promise. Whatever Morrison was planning, whatever the cost to himself, he would keep them safe. Not because he had to, not because it was expected, but because for the first time in his life he had found something worth fighting for. The move to the penthouse happened in the early hours of the morning, when the city was still sleeping. Alexander's security team coordinated everything with military precision, ensuring they weren't followed. Emma held the twins close in the back of the armored SUV, while Alexander watched the streets carefully from the front passenger seat. The new penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a recently renovated building in a quiet part of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views, but the glass was bulletproof, and the latest security technology was seamlessly integrated into every aspect of the space. The elevator requires both a keycard and biometric verification, Alexander explained as they entered. Only you, me, and Catherine are authorized. Even the maintenance staff has to be cleared 24 hours in advance. Emma took in the space with wide eyes. Unlike Alexander's other penthouse, this one felt warm and inviting. The furniture was comfortable rather than sculptural, the colors soft and soothing. Most surprisingly, one of the rooms had already been converted into a nursery, complete with 2 hand-painted cribs and a rocking chair by the window. Catherine, Alexander explained, noticing her surprise. She's been busy while we were planning the move. The twins, despite the early hour, were wide awake and curious. Lucas immediately began crawling toward a pile of soft toys in the corner, while Lily watched the city lights with fascination. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly, "but also a bit overwhelming. All of this," she gestured at the space. "I'm not used to feeling safe." Alexander wanted to respond, to reassure her, but his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his security team. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Emma asked, immediately alert. He hesitated, remembering his promise of complete honesty. "Morrison's been making moves. He's filed an emergency custody petition, claiming you're mentally unstable and that I've been helping you evade court orders." Emma's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "We knew he would try something like this. What else?" "He's also spreading rumors to the press, suggesting that our relationship began before you left him, that this whole situation was planned to destroy his reputation," Emma finished. "He's trying to paint me as the villain and you as my accomplice." She laughed bitterly. Classic. James, he always was good at twisting the truth. Alexander watched as she walked to the window, picking up Lily, who had started to fuss. The baby immediately calmed in her mother's arms, tiny hands reaching for Emma's face. "You know what's strange?" Emma said, still looking out at the city. "A part of me is almost relieved. This is the James I know, the manipulator, the man who twists everything to maintain control. It's easier to fight an enemy who shows his true face." Alexander moved closer, drawn by the strength in her voice. "We'll fight him, Emma. Catherine's evidence about his foundation." "Might not be enough," she interrupted gently. "James is very good at covering his tracks, and he has powerful friends. So do I." "Had," she corrected. "You gave that up, for us." She turned to face him, Lily still cradled in her arms. "Why did you do it, Alexander? Really?" He looked at her, really looked at her. In the soft morning light, with her guard down and her eyes full of questions, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. It was the beauty of someone who had been broken, but refused to let it make her bitter, who had every reason to stop trusting but chose to believe in goodness anyway. "Because you showed me what real strength looks like," he said finally. "Not the kind that comes from money or power or control. The kind that comes from loving something more than yourself." Emma's breath caught at the rawness in his voice. Before she could respond, Lucas crawled over and pulled himself up using Alexander's pant leg, demanding attention. Alexander lifted him automatically, and suddenly they were standing there, the 4 of them, like a photograph of what could be. "I don't know what we are," Emma said softly, "or what we're becoming. But I do know this. The man James is trying to paint you as, the cold, calculating businessman who seduced his way into a family crisis, that man doesn't read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. He doesn't get up at 3 a.m. to check if a baby's cough is serious. He doesn't look at twins who aren't his and see infinite possibility instead of obligation." Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge spreading through him. But before he could find words to respond, his phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. The headline made his blood run cold. Pierce Industries announces major restructuring. Former CEO's replacement promises return to traditional values and stability. The accompanying photo showed his father shaking hands with James Morrison, both men smiling for the cameras. The message was clear. The game was changing, and the stakes were higher than ever. The news of Morrison's alliance with Pierce Industries spread quickly through the business world. Alexander spent the morning fielding calls from loyal employees who were being pushed out in the restructuring, while Emma tried to maintain the twins' routine despite the growing tension. "They're systematically removing anyone who might be sympathetic to us," Alexander explained during lunch, watching as Emma fed the twins in their high chairs. "Morrison's influence in the company is growing by the hour." "He's building a power base," Emma said, wiping pureed carrots from Lily's chin. "It's what he does, accumulates influence and authority until he's untouchable." She smiled sadly. At Lucas, who was more interested in wearing his food than eating it. "I watched him do it in our community, in his charitable foundation, in every aspect of our lives." Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. "Emergency, turn on the news." He grabbed the remote, switching on the living room television. James Morrison's face filled the screen, standing at a podium with Robert Pierce by his side. "As the newly appointed head of Pierce Industries' charitable foundation," Morrison was saying, his voice practiced and sincere, "I want to address the troubling rumors surrounding my family situation. My ex-wife Emma Thompson is a troubled woman who needs help. I've tried to provide that help, to be patient and understanding." Emma's hands gripped the twins' high chairs, her knuckles white. Alexander moved to turn off the TV, but she stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "I need to hear this." When Alexander Pierce took advantage of her vulnerable state, Morrison continued, manipulating her trust for his own agenda against his father's company, he crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. "I am announcing today that I am filing for full custody of my children, and I ask for the public's support in bringing them home safely." The press conference erupted in questions, but Emma had heard enough. She lifted Lucas from his high chair, holding him close as if someone might snatch him away at any moment. "He's playing the concerned father," she said, her voice shaking. "The successful businessman worried about his unstable ex-wife, and the man taking advantage of her. It's a perfect narrative." Alexander moved to her side, instinctively reaching for Lily, who was beginning to sense the tension. "Emma, look at me." He waited until she met his eyes. "He's trying to provoke us, to make us react emotionally. That's not how we'll win this." "How will we win it?" she asked, bouncing Lucas gently as he began to fuss. "He has your father's resources now, the media eating out of his hand, and a team of lawyers ready to paint me as an unfit mother." "We'll win it by telling the truth," Catherine's voice came from the elevator. She strode into the penthouse, arms full of files. "Every carefully constructed lie has a weak point. Morrison's is his foundation." She spread the documents on the dining table, careful to avoid the remnants of the twins' lunch. "I've found a pattern. The foundation receives large donations from companies just before they receive favorable treatment from city development committees. Committees where Morrison has influence. Pay to play," Alexander murmured, studying the documents. "But proving it will be difficult," Catherine finished, "but not impossible. Especially since one of those companies just had a very interesting change of heart." She smiled. "Turns out their new CEO has a sister who escaped an abusive marriage. She's willing to testify about Morrison's charitable contributions and what was expected in return." Emma listened to them discuss legal strategies and evidence, trails, but her attention was drawn to the twins. They were playing on their mat nearby, completely unaware of the forces gathering against them. Lily had discovered her reflection in a mirror, while Lucas was determined to climb over every cushion in sight. "They deserve better than this," she said suddenly, interrupting the siblings' discussion. "Better than being pawns in James's games. Better than living in hiding. Hey!" Alexander moved to her side, his hand finding hers naturally. "They have better. They have you. A mother who would do anything to protect them. They have Catherine, who's apparently a secret financial investigator." His sister grinned at that. "And they have me for whatever that's worth." Emma looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. In the weeks since that night by the railroad tracks, something had been growing between them. Something that went beyond gratitude or obligation. She saw it in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, felt it in the gentle brush of his hand when he passed her morning coffee, heard it in his voice when he read bedtime stories to the twins. "It's worth everything," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "But Alexander, if this goes wrong, if James wins—" "He won't," Catherine interrupted firmly. "Because unlike him, we're not fighting for power or control or reputation. We're fighting for family." She smiled at the twins. "Speaking of which, I believe I was promised some quality aunt time with my favorite niece and nephew." As Catherine settled on the floor with the babies, Emma led Alexander to the kitchen, needing a moment away from watchful eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Not just of James, but of how much I've come to depend on you, how much the twins have come to love you. If we lose this fight—" Alexander touched her cheek gently, and she leaned into his hand without thinking. "We won't lose," he said, "because this time you're not fighting alone, and Emma—" He waited until she met his gaze. "I've come to depend on you too, on all of you, more than I ever thought possible." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words and growing possibilities. In the living room, they could hear Catherine making the twins laugh, the sound of simple joy cutting through the tension of the day. It was Lily's cry of "Lex" that broke the moment, making them both smile. The baby had recently started trying to say his name, though it usually came out as more of a happy squeal. "Duty calls," Emma said softly, but neither of them moved immediately, both aware that something had shifted between them, something that even James Morrison's schemes couldn't touch. Catherine's evidence against Morrison's foundation sparked a quiet investigation, but their opponent wasn't sitting idle. Over the next few days, a series of calculated attacks began to unfold. First came the financial pressure. Alexander's personal accounts were suddenly flagged for audit, investment. Partners withdrew from his independent ventures, and long-standing business relationships mysteriously dissolved. "They're trying to isolate us," Alexander explained to Emma one evening after the twins were asleep. They sat on the penthouse balcony, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. "Morrison and my father are systematically cutting off our resources." Emma wrapped her hands around her tea mug, more for comfort than warmth. "James always did believe that everyone had a price. That loyalty was just a matter of finding the right leverage." She looked at Alexander. "Does it bother you, watching everything you built crumble?" He studied her face in the soft evening light, realizing that the answer surprised even him. "No," he said simply. "What bothers me is knowing that I used to be part of that world, where power was everything and people were just pieces to be moved around a board." A soft cry from the nursery interrupted them. Emma started to rise, but Alexander touched her arm gently. "I'll go. You finish your tea." She watched him disappear into the penthouse, marveling at how natural it felt now. This shared care of the twins, this quiet domesticity that had grown between them. A few minutes later, she heard his voice through the baby monitor, soft and gentle as he soothed Lily back to sleep. "There we go, princess, just a bad dream. Everything's okay now." Emma closed her eyes, letting his voice wash over her. How different he was from James, whose idea of parenting had been creating spreadsheets of developmental milestones and educational objectives before the twins were even born. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Rachel. "Just saw James on the morning shows. He's playing the heartbroken father role perfectly. Be careful, Em." Before she could respond, Alexander returned to the balcony. One look at her face told him something was wrong. "Rachel?" he asked, settling beside her. "Again." Emma nodded, showing him the message. "James is ramping up the public pressure. Rachel says he's been making the rounds on all the morning shows playing the victim." "He's good at it," Alexander acknowledged. "But Emma, that's all it is. A performance. The truth is in the foundation's records, in the pattern of bribes and favors. Catherine's contact might not be enough," Emma interrupted gently. "You don't know James like I do. He'll have contingencies for his contingencies." "The woman who's willing to testify?" He'll find something to discredit her, or someone to pressure her into silence. Alexander reached for her hand, an instinct he'd stopped fighting weeks ago. Then we'll find another way. Morrison isn't the only one who can play the media game. Emma tensed. What do you mean? I mean, it's time to tell our story. The real story. He turned to face her fully. Not through lawyers or press releases, but in our own words. Let people see the truth, not just about Morrison's business dealings, but about who he really is. Alexander, I can't. The things he did, the way he controlled everything. I'm not ready to share that publicly. Then we start smaller, he suggested. There's a journalist I trust, Sandra Chen. She used to investigate corporate corruption before the major networks bought her silence. She's been reaching out, wanting to hear our side. Emma was quiet for a long moment, absently running her thumb over Alexander's knuckles. The twins, she said finally. If we do this, I want them kept out of it completely. No photos, no details about them. They deserve privacy. Of course. We'll set clear boundaries with Sandra. He squeezed her hand gently. Emma, we don't have to do this if you're not ready. We can find another way, she shook her head. No, you're right. Hiding in silence, that's what James wants. That's what he always wanted. For me to be quiet, compliant, invisible. She straightened her shoulders. I won't let him make me disappear again. Alexander felt a surge of pride mixed with something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to name. I'll contact Sandra in the morning. We'll do this on your terms, at your pace. Emma looked at their joined hands, then up at the star-scattered sky. You know what scares me most? She asked softly. Not James's threats or the custody battle or even the public scrutiny. What scares me is how easy this feels, being here with you, sharing a life, raising the twins together. I'm terrified of losing it. Alexander turned her face gently toward. Here's your Emma, look at me. He waited until her eyes met his. Whatever happens with Morrison, whatever story we tell the world, what we've built here, is real. I'm not going anywhere. A cool breeze swept across the balcony, carrying the distant sounds of the city. In the nursery, they could hear Lucas's soft snores through the baby monitor, punctuated by Lily's occasional sighs. It was a moment of perfect peace before the storm they knew was coming. Emma leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, letting herself believe just for a moment that they could win this fight. That there was a future where her children could grow up free from their father's manipulation, where this fragile happiness she'd found could become something permanent. Okay, she whispered, let's tell our story. Let's show the world who James Morrison really is. Alexander pressed a kiss to her hair, a gesture so natural it surprised them both. Tomorrow, they would face the cameras, the questions, the judgment, but tonight they had this, the quiet understanding between them, the sleeping twins, and the promise of a future worth fighting for. Sandra Chen arrived at the penthouse early the next morning, her reputation for integrity evident in her careful approach to the interview. She sat up in the living room, keeping her voice low when she noticed the twins napping in the nursery. Before we begin, she said, arranging her recording equipment, I want you both to understand something. This story, it's not about scandal or sensationalism, it's about truth. Are you ready for that? Emma sat on the couch, Alexander beside her, their shoulders barely touching but drawing strength from the proximity. Yes, Emma said firmly. It's time people knew the real James Morrison. The interview began gently, with Sandra asking about their backgrounds. But soon they reached the heart of the story. Emma's marriage to James, the gradual erosion of her independence, the controlling behavior that the public never saw. He was so careful at first, Emma explained, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the memories. Everything was framed as concern, as wanting what was best for me. When I got pregnant with the twins, he said I should quit teaching because the stress wasn't good for the babies. When I wanted to visit my sister, he'd remind me how dangerous travel was during pregnancy. Sandra nodded, taking notes. And after the twins were born? The control became more obvious. He installed cameras throughout the house, monitored every phone call, every email. He had spreadsheets for everything, feeding schedules, development milestones, future educational plans. The twins weren't even 6 months old, and he was already mapping out their entire lives. Alexander listened, his hand finding Emma's. As she described the night she discovered the trust fund documents, the ones that treated her children like assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. "And Mr. Pierce," Sandra turned to Alexander, "what made you get involved?" "I found them by the railroad tracks," he said simply. "But the truth is, they found me. I was living in a world very similar to Morrison's, where control was everything, and human connection was seen as weakness. Emma and the twins, they showed me a different way to live." The interview continued for hours, covering Morrison's business practices, the Foundation's suspicious activities, and the recent alliance with Pierce Industries. When they finally finished, Sandra turned off her recorder and sat back. "This will air tomorrow evening," she said. "Are you both prepared for the backlash? Morrison won't take this lying down." Before they could respond, Catherine burst into the penthouse, her face pale. "Turn on the news, now!" Alexander grabbed the remote and James Morrison's face filled the screen. He was standing outside the family court building, looking appropriately somber. "Today," he announced, "I filed an emergency petition for sole custody of my children, along with a restraining order against both Emma Thompson and Alexander Pierce. The evidence we've presented to the court shows a pattern of unstable behavior and poor judgment that puts my children at risk." Emma's grip on Alexander's hand tightened as Morrison continued. "Furthermore, we've submitted documentation proving that Mr. Pierce's involvement was not, as they claim, a random act of kindness. Phone records show contact between him and my ex-wife, dating back months before their supposed first meeting." "That's a lie," Emma whispered. We know," Catherine said grimly, "but he's fabricated evidence to support his story. He's painting this as a calculated attempt by Alexander to use you and the twins to attack Pierce Industries." Sandra Chen was already making calls. "I can rush the interview to air tonight instead of tomorrow," she offered. "Get your side of the story out there before his narrative takes hold." But Alexander was watching Emma, seeing the fear creep back into her eyes. "No," he said firmly. "We do this right, not rushed. Morrison wants us to react emotionally, to look desperate." He turned to Emma. "We know the truth. So does everyone who matters." As if to emphasize his point, Lucas's voice came through the baby monitor, calling Mama and Lex in his baby babble. Emma closed her eyes, drawing strength from the sound. "Alexander's right," she said finally. "James wants us to panic, to make mistakes, but we're not playing his game anymore." She looked at Sandra. "Run the interview as planned tomorrow. Let people see the whole truth, not just sound bites and accusations." After Sandra left, promising to call with updates, Catherine hugged them both. "I'll have our lawyers prepare responses to the custody filing. We knew this was coming. We're ready for it." Left alone, Emma and Alexander stood by the nursery door, watching the twins play in their cribs. Lily was standing, bouncing excitedly when she saw them, while Lucas was more interested in his stuffed elephant. "I meant what I said," Emma spoke softly. "We're not playing his game anymore. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever people believe, the truth is right here in this room." Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him naturally. "Yes," he agreed. "The truth is right here." They stood there together, watching their unlikely family, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges, but facing them with something Morrison could never understand, the strength that comes from choosing love over power, truth over control, and each other over everything else. The evening Sandra Chen's interview aired, the penthouse was quiet, except for the soft murmur of the television. Emma sat curled on the couch, Alexander beside her, while Catherine paced behind them, phone in hand. The twins were asleep in the nursery, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. Sandra's piece was masterfully crafted. She began not with accusations or sensationalism, but with simple human moments. Emma reading to the twins, Alexander preparing their bottles with practiced ease, the natural rhythm of a family that had found each other in the most unexpected way. Then came the harder truths. Emma's voice, strong and clear, detailed the subtle progression of control in her marriage to James, the cameras hidden in the nursery, the tracked phone calls, the spreadsheets mapping out every aspect of the twins' futures. It wasn't love. Emma's recorded voice explained. It was ownership. The twins weren't children to him, they were assets to be managed, shaped, controlled. The segment shifted to Morrison's foundation, with Sandra methodically laying out the pattern of suspicious donations and political favors. Former employees spoke anonymously about the culture of fear and control. Financial experts analyzed the irregular money flows. But it was Alexander's part of the interview that caught everyone off guard. He spoke not about Morrison's crimes or business dealings, but about transformation. I used to believe what James Morrison believes, that control is power, that vulnerability is weakness. Finding Emma and the twins that night by the railroad tracks, it didn't just save them, it saved me. Catherine's phone buzzed constantly with reactions pouring in. Social media is exploding, she reported. Morrison's carefully crafted image is cracking. People are coming forward with their own stories about his foundation's pressure tactics. Emma watched her own face on the screen, remembering each word. She'd spoken. He'll retaliate, she said softly. This will make him furious. As if on cue, Alexander's phone lit up with a message from his father. You've chosen your path, don't expect any help when Morrison destroys you both. But there were other messages too, from former employees expressing support, from domestic violence survivors thanking Emma for speaking out, from business associates, quietly offering to help expose Morrison's corrupt practices. It's working, Catherine said, scrolling through her phone. The story's too big to bury now, too many people are paying attention. Emma stood suddenly, needing to check on the twins. Alexander followed her to the nursery, understanding her need to see them, to confirm their safety. They stood in the doorway watching Lucas and Lily sleep peacefully in their cribs. I've never felt stronger than I did telling our story, Emma whispered, and never more terrified of the consequences. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back into his embrace. Look at them, he said softly. Really look. They're not afraid. They're not controlled. They're just free. That's what we're fighting for. Lily stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand clutching her favorite blanket. Lucas had somehow managed to surround himself with every stuffed animal in his crib, his peaceful face peeking out from among them. When James and I were married, Emma continued, her voice barely a whisper, he used to say that love was a weakness that successful people couldn't afford. That real strength came from being untouchable. And now? She turned in his arms, looking up at him. Now I know that real strength is this, being touchable, being vulnerable, being brave enough to love even when it scares you. Alexander's hand came up to cup her cheek, and Emma leaned into his touch. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words and growing certainty. Emma, he began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. Wait, she said softly. Before you say anything else, I need you to know something. This isn't gratitude or dependency. What I feel for you, it's not because you saved us that night. It's because of who you've chosen to become every day since. In the living room, they could hear Catherine still fielding calls, the aftermath of their story continuing to ripple outward. But here in the nursery, watching over the sleeping twins, Emma and Alexander were in their own world. I love you, he said simply, the words feeling both monumental and completely natural. Not because you needed saving, but because you showed me how to save myself. Emma's response was to rise on her tiptoes and kiss him, gentle and sure. It was their first kiss, but it felt like coming home, like every step of their journey had been leading to this moment. When they parted, Emma rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. We should get back, she said finally. Catherine will be wondering where we are. Let her wonder, Alexander murmured into her hair. But they did return to the living room, where Catherine was too absorbed in her phone to notice their clasped hands or the new lightness in their expressions. The interview continued to play on the television, their recorded voices telling their story to the world. But the real story, Emma thought, was here in this moment, in the sleeping twins, in Catherine's fierce loyalty, in Alexander's steady presence beside her. Whatever Morrison's retaliation would be, they would face it together, not as victim and savior, not as business rivals, but as partners who had found something worth fighting for, A love that made them stronger, not weaker, and a family built on choice rather than control. The morning after the interview aired dawned bright and clear. But the real illumination came from Catherine's early arrival, with stacks of newspapers and endless digital updates. The story had exploded overnight, taking on a life of its own. 3 more former employees of Morrison's Foundation have come forward, Catherine announced, spreading newspapers across the kitchen counter while Emma prepared the twins' breakfast. They're confirming everything. The pressure tactics, the suspicious donations, all of it. Alexander, who had been helping Lucas with his morning bottle, looked up. Any response from Morrison's camp? Nothing official yet, but Catherine hesitated, glancing at Emma. His lawyers filed additional documents with the family court last night. They're pushing for an emergency hearing. Emma's hands stilled on the bowl of baby cereal she was preparing for Lily. How soon? Tomorrow morning. Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. But Emma, this isn't like before. The public narrative has shifted. Morrison's not just fighting you now. He's fighting his own crumbling reputation. As if to prove her point, Catherine's phone buzzed with another update. The State Attorney General's office just announced they're opening an investigation into the Foundation's financial practices. Alexander moved to Emma's side, taking over the preparation of Lily's breakfast so she could process the news. The simple domestic gesture spoke volumes about how their relationship had evolved, especially since last night's revelations in the nursery. "What's our strategy for the hearing?" Emma asked, watching as Alexander expertly managed to keep both twins entertained while serving their breakfast. "We go in strong," Catherine replied. "We have documentation of Morrison's controlling behavior, testimony from your old neighbors about the surveillance, and now the Foundation investigation adds credibility to your concerns about his character. And the fabricated evidence he claims to have about Alexander and me. Already handled," Catherine smiled. "Our technical team found proof that the phone records were altered. Morrison got sloppy. He was too eager to create his narrative." Lily chose that moment to demonstrate her growing vocabulary, pointing at Alexander and declaring love lex with all the certainty a baby could muster. The adult's laughter broke the tension, and Emma felt something settle in her chest, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "I'm ready," she said, watching Alexander clean pureed fruit from Lucas's cheeks. "Whatever Morrison throws at us tomorrow, I'm ready." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of preparation. Lawyers came and went, reviewing strategies and practicing testimony. Catherine coordinated with the technical team, analyzing Morrison's fabricated evidence. Through it all, Alexander and Emma maintained their focus on the twins, determined to keep their routine as normal as possible. That evening, after the lawyers had left and Catherine had gone home, they stood on the balcony again, their spot for quiet moments of truth. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, "about what happens after tomorrow, after all this is over." Emma turned to look at him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean this penthouse, this life we've built. It was meant to be temporary, a safe harbor until the storm passed. But Emma," he took her hands in his, "I don't want temporary anymore." "Alexander, let me finish," he said gently. "I know the timing isn't perfect. We're in the middle of a legal battle. The media circus is at its peak, and we just went public with our relationship last night. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were different from any she'd shed before. These were tears of joy, of possibility, of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "The twins need stability," he continued. "They need a home, not just a safe house. They need a father who loves them for who they are, not what they can become. And he took a deep breath. "I need you. All of you. Not because I saved you that night, but because you save me every day with your strength, your love, your trust. Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not right away. We can wait until the dust settles, until Morrison is out of our lives, until you're ready. But I want you to know that this is real, that it's permanent, that—" Emma silenced him with a kiss, rising on her tiptoes just as she had the night before. When they parted, she was smiling through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to permanence, yes to building a life together, yes to everything." From the nursery they heard Lucas's familiar call of "Mama, Lex," followed by Lily's delighted echo. They went to them together as they had so many times before, but now with a new certainty about their future. The twins were standing in their cribs, reaching for them with complete trust and love. As they lifted them out, Emma thought about tomorrow's hearing, about Morrison's inevitable attacks, about all the challenges still ahead. But looking at Alexander with Lucas in his arms, at Lily reaching for both of them, she knew that Morrison had already lost his most important battle. He had tried to control love, to turn it into a transaction, a power play. But real love, the kind that had grown in this penthouse among 4 unlikely people, couldn't be controlled or calculated or contained. It could only be chosen again and again every day, and they had chosen each other. The morning of the custody hearing brought a tense atmosphere to the penthouse. Emma stood in front of the mirror, smoothing her conservative navy dress, while Alexander helped Catherine settle the twins with their trusted nanny. "Remember," Catherine was saying, "no matter what happens in that courtroom, the public is on your side now. Morrison's foundation is under investigation. His business partners are distancing themselves." "None of that matters," Emma interrupted, softly, watching through the doorway as Alexander knelt to kiss each twin goodbye. "The only thing that matters is the judge believing the truth about James." The drive to the courthouse was quiet, their hands clasped together in the back of the car, while Catherine reviewed last-minute details with their legal team via phone. News vans lined the street. Reporters clustered at the courthouse steps. "Ready?" Alexander asked as their car approached. Emma squeezed his hand. "As long as you're with me." They emerged from the car into a storm of camera flashes and shouted questions. Alexander's arm around her waist was steady, protective without being possessive, everything James had never been. Catherine flanked them on the other side, creating a united front as they climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, their lawyers waited with updates. "Morrison's team is trying to exclude the Foundation investigation evidence," one reported. "They're arguing it's not relevant to custody." "Of course they are," Catherine muttered. "His whole case falls apart if the judge sees the pattern of control and manipulation." Before Emma could respond, a hush fell over the corridor. James Morrison was approaching, flanked by his legal team and Robert Pierce. He looked exactly as Emma remembered, perfectly groomed, expertly controlling his expression, power radiating from every calculated movement. "Emma," he said smoothly, as if they were meeting at a social event, "you're looking well. I trust my children are being properly cared for." Emma felt Alexander tense beside her, but she stood straighter. "Our children are perfect, James. They're happy, healthy, and free." Something flickered in Morrison's eyes at the word free, a crack in his perfect facade. But before he could respond, the bailiff called them into the courtroom. The proceedings began with Morrison's team presenting their case. They painted a picture of Emma as unstable, manipulated by Alexander in a complex scheme to damage Pierce Industries. They produced carefully selected photos, edited video clips, and testimony from witnesses who spoke about Emma's erratic behavior after leaving James. But Catherine's preparation paid off. During cross-examination, their lawyers systematically exposed the holes in Morrison's evidence. The supposedly concerned witnesses were revealed to have financial connections to his foundation. The surveillance footage from their former home, meant to show Emma's instability, instead demonstrated James's obsessive control. Then it was their turn. Emma took the stand first, her voice steady as she told their story. She spoke about the gradual erosion of her freedom, the suffocating control, the moment she discovered James's plans for the twins' futures mapped out in cold corporate terms. "The final straw," she explained, "wasn't fear for myself. It was reading those documents and realizing that to James, Lucas, and Lily weren't children to be loved. They were assets to be managed. Their entire lives were planned without any consideration for who they might want to become." Morrison's lawyer tried to shake her testimony, but Emma remained calm. When he presented the fabricated phone records suggesting prior contact with Alexander, She waited for their technical expert to methodically demonstrate the alterations. Alexander's testimony followed. He spoke not as the former CEO of Pierce Industries, but as a man transformed by love and responsibility. "The night I found them by the railroad tracks," he explained, "I was living much like James Morrison, believing that control was strength and emotional connection was weakness. Emma and the twins didn't just need saving that night. They showed me what real strength looks like." The courtroom was silent as he described the twins' milestones. First words, first steps, first signs of their distinct personalities emerging. He spoke about Lily's determination to climb everything in sight, Lucas's gentle way with smaller babies at the park, their joint love of bedtime stories. "They're not statistics in a spreadsheet or assets to be managed," he concluded. "They're children who deserve to grow up free to become whoever they're meant to be." Then came their secret weapon, the evidence Catherine had gathered about Morrison's foundation. Despite his team's objections, the judge allowed it, recognizing the pattern of control and manipulation as relevant to the custody decision. Financial experts testified about the irregularities in the foundation's records. Former employees spoke about Morrison's ruthless tactics and obsession with control. But the most damaging testimony came from a surprising source, Robert Pierce himself. Alexander's father had been called by Morrison's team, expected to support their narrative about his son's vindictive scheme. Instead, faced with the evidence of Morrison's corruption and seeing his son's transformation, something in the elder, Pierce seemed to crack. "My son," he said slowly, "has become a better man than I raised him to be. He found something I never could, the courage to choose love over power." James Morrison's perfect mask slipped then, revealing a flash of the rage beneath. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd," he snapped. "These children are mine. Their futures were secured, their paths set for success. I won't let them be ruined by some emotional fantasy of family and freedom." The judge's gavel cracked sharply. "Mr. Morrison, control yourself or you'll be held in contempt." But Morrison wasn't finished. "Everything I did was for their benefit. The surveillance, the planning, the control, it was all to ensure they wouldn't be weak, wouldn't be vulnerable like their mother." His outburst hung in the air, more damaging than any evidence they could have presented. Emma felt tears in her eyes, not from fear this time, but from relief. Finally, everyone could see the truth she'd lived with for so long. Alexander's hand found hers as they waited for the judge's decision. Catherine sat behind them, her presence steady and supportive. Outside the courtroom, they could hear the murmur of reporters and spectators, but inside, in this moment, the world had narrowed to the sound of the judge clearing his throat. The judge's decision was clear and unequivocal. Full custody was awarded to Emma, with James Morrison granted only supervised visitation rights, pending completion of counseling and parenting classes. More importantly, the judge issued a permanent restraining order, ensuring that Morrison couldn't use his resources to continue monitoring or controlling their lives. As they left the courthouse, the media frenzy had intensified. But this time, Emma faced the cameras with confidence, Alexander's arm around her waist not for protection now, but in celebration. "All I've ever wanted," she told the reporters, "was for my children to grow up free to become themselves. Today, that freedom is guaranteed." The drive home was filled with a lightness none of them had felt in months. Catherine was already receiving updates about the impact of the hearing. Morrison's foundation was under formal investigation, his business partners were dissolving ties, and the carefully constructed empire of control he'd built was crumbling. But Emma's thoughts were only on the twins. As they rode up in the elevator, she could hardly wait to hold them, to know that they were finally, truly safe. The scene that greeted them in the penthouse made them all pause. Lucas and Lily were in the living room with their nanny, surrounded by building blocks. They had constructed something that looked vaguely like a castle, and Lily was placing her favorite stuffed elephant on top as a finishing touch. "Mama! Lex!" Lucas spotted them first, his face lighting up. He took a few wobbly steps toward them, before sitting down abruptly, laughing at his own stumble. Lily was right behind him, managing to stay upright as she toddled over, arms raised in their familiar request to be lifted. Alexander scooped her up, while Emma knelt to gather Lucas in her arms. "We did it, little ones," Emma whispered, touching her forehead to Lucas's while reaching out to hold Lily's tiny hand. "We're free." The nanny quietly excused herself, leaving the family to their celebration. Catherine hung back, watching her brother with the twins, seeing how naturally he had stepped into the role of father. "I should go too," she said, smiling, at the scene. "There's still work to be done with the Foundation investigation and—" "Stay," Emma interrupted, still holding Lucas. "You're part of this family too. We wouldn't be here without you." As if to emphasize the point, Lily reached out from Alexander's arms, calling Cat Cat, her version of Catherine's name. Even Lucas joined in, making it impossible for Catherine to refuse. They ordered dinner in, spreading blankets on the living room floor for an impromptu picnic. The twins were fascinated by the casual setting, treating it like a grand adventure. Lily insisted on offering bites of her food to everyone, while Lucas was more interested in rearranging the blankets into new configurations. As the evening wound down, Catherine finally left to handle the press response, leaving Alexander and Emma alone with the sleepy twins. They went through their bedtime routine together, baths, stories, lullabies. It felt different now, knowing this wasn't temporary, wasn't under threat. After the twins were asleep, they returned to their balcony, their special place for important moments. The city stretched out before them, but it felt different now, not a place to hide, but a world of possibilities. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, pulling Emma close, "about the wedding." She looked up at him, smiling. "Already planning?" "Not exactly. I was thinking, what if we did something small? Just family here in the penthouse. The twins could toddle down a makeshift aisle. Catherine could be our witness." "Perfect," Emma said simply. "When? Next month? Give the media circus time to die down, but not so long that we're waiting just for the sake of waiting." Emma turned in his arms, looking out at the city. "You know what I love most about that idea? It's exactly what we want, not what anyone else expects. No grand society wedding, no corporate merging of empires, just us choosing each other." "Speaking of choices," Alexander said, "I've been talking with Catherine about starting something new. A foundation, but a real one this time, focused on helping families escape controlling situations, providing resources, support. Using our story to help others write their own," Emma finished. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about teaching again, not right away, but eventually. Maybe working with your foundation, helping other women recognize the signs I missed for so long." Alexander kissed her temple. "Whatever you want to do, whenever you're ready. No spreadsheets, no planned paths." A soft cry from the nursery interrupted them. Lily's familiar call for one last good-night kiss. They went together, as they had so many times before, but now with the certainty that this was their future, freely chosen and fought for. The twins were both awake, standing in their cribs with sleepy smiles. Lucas reached for Emma, while Lily made grabby hands at Alexander, their perfect little family circle complete. "You know," Emma said softly, watching Alexander settle Lily back down with gentle whispers, "James never understood that this is what real power looks like. Not control or manipulation or perfectly planned futures, just love, freely given and freely returned." Looking at their children, at the man who had become their father through choice rather than obligation, Emma felt the last shadows of her past fade away. They had all been transformed by that night by the railroad tracks, not just saved but set free to become who they were meant to be. The future stretched out before them, not as a carefully plotted spreadsheet, but as an open road of possibilities. There would be challenges, certainly, but they would face them together, their strength coming not from control, but from the freedom to choose each other every day. The weeks following the custody hearing brought a different kind of busy to the penthouse. Instead of legal documents and strategy sessions, the space was filled with wedding preparations, simple but meaningful touches that reflected their journey together. Emma stood in what had become their home office, now temporarily converted into a staging area for wedding plans. Catherine had helped them maintain their desire for intimacy while adding touches of elegance that made the event feel special without being ostentatious. "The flowers will be delivered the morning of," Catherine explained, showing Emma the arrangements they'd chosen. Soft whites and blues, simple but elegant. "And the twins' outfits are ready for their final fitting." The mention of the twins drew Emma's attention to the window, where she could see Alexander in the living room, practicing with Lucas and Lily for their roles as ring-bearers. He had created a game out of it, making them laugh as they toddled down their makeshift aisle with empty ring boxes. "They're naturals," Catherine commented, following Emma's gaze, "though I suspect Lily will try to steal the show." As if on cue, Lily twirled in her practice dress, tumbling into Alexander's waiting arms with delighted giggles. Lucas, ever the observer, watched his sister's antics with a thoughtful expression that made him look so much like Alexander that Emma's heart squeezed. "It's amazing," Emma said softly, "how completely he's become their father. Not through obligation or legal documents, but through 1,000 small moments of love." Catherine smiled, setting aside her planning notebook. "You know, when Alexander first told me about finding you and the twins that night, I was worried. Not about his intentions, but about whether he could truly break free from our father's influence, from the world of control we were raised in. What changed your mind?" "Watching him with the twins. The first time I saw him reading them a bedtime story, doing all the different voices." Catherine laughed at the memory. "That's when I knew. My brother, the ruthless CEO who once cancelled a merger because the numbers were 0.02% off projections, was completely wrapped around their tiny fingers." Emma's attention was drawn back to the living room, where Alexander had now engaged the twins in what appeared to be a serious discussion about their favorite stuffed animals' roles in the ceremony. "The foundation paperwork came through," Catherine continued, changing subjects. "Everything's set up. You can start working on programs whenever you're ready." The foundation had become their shared passion, a way to help other families break free from controlling situations. They had already begun developing support programs, combining Emma's background in education with Alexander's business acumen and Catherine's legal expertise. "We've already had 3 families reach out through the preliminary website," Emma shared. "Women who recognize their own situations in our story. One of them has twins too." Their conversation was interrupted by Lucas's excited voice calling, "Mama, come see." He had apparently mastered walking backward down their pretend aisle, a skill he was eager to demonstrate. Emma joined them in the living room, immediately swept into their practice session. Lily insisted on showing her special twirl, while Lucas solemnly presented her with his empty ring box. "I think we're ready for the real thing," Alexander declared, gathering both twins into his arms. They had grown so much in the months since that night by the railroad tracks, yet they still fit perfectly in his embrace. "Almost ready," Emma corrected, touching Lily's nose playfully. "We still need to practice with the actual rings." "About that," Alexander's voice took on a tone that made Emma look up. "I have something to show you. Catherine, would you mind watching the twins for a moment?" Catherine was already moving to take them, clearly in on whatever Alexander had planned. He led Emma to their bedroom, where a small wooden box sat on the dresser. "I wanted to give you these before the ceremony," he explained, opening the box to reveal 2 sets of rings. The first pair was obviously their wedding bands, simple, elegant platinum rings that matched perfectly, but it was the second pair that caught Emma's breath. "Are those tiny versions of our rings," Alexander confirmed, "for the twins?" "I thought, well, this isn't just about us getting married. It's about making official what we already know, that we're a family." Emma touched the small rings gently. They were perfect miniatures, designed to be worn on chains around the twins' necks. The inscriptions, Alexander continued, showing her the tiny engravings. Lucas's says, "Chosen with love," and Lily's says, "Free to soar." "I thought," Emma silenced him with a kiss, tears of joy making the rings blur before her eyes. When they parted, she whispered, "They're perfect. Everything about this is perfect." From the living room, they could hear Lily's delighted shriek as Catherine presumably demonstrated her own twirling technique. Lucas's more reserved giggles followed, along with the sound of tiny feet running on hardwood floors. "Should we rescue your sister?" Emma asked, wiping her eyes with a laugh. "In a minute," Alexander replied, pulling her close again. "First, I want to say something. These past months, watching you rebuild your life, seeing your strength and resilience, it's been the greatest privilege of my life. You didn't just save yourself and the twins that night. You saved all of us, me from becoming my father, Catherine from her isolation, even my father from his own bitterness." Emma touched his face gently. "We saved each other, and now we get to help others save themselves." They returned to the living room to find Catherine had initiated what appeared to be a dancing lesson, with both twins attempting to copy her graceful movements with varying degrees of success. Lily had somehow acquired a flower from one of the sample arrangements and was wearing it proudly behind her ear. "Mama, let's dance," Lucas called out, holding his arms up in a mimicry of a formal dance pose. And so they did, right there in the living room, practicing their first dance as a family while the twins twirled around them and Catherine hummed a waltz. It wasn't the carefully choreographed performance that society weddings demanded, but it was perfect in its joyful spontaneity. This, Emma thought as Alexander spun her gently, careful of the toddlers circling their feet, was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of connection as James had believed, but the presence of love, freely given and joyfully received. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows as the small family prepared for their special day. The ceremony wasn't scheduled until afternoon, giving them time to maintain the twins' routine, a decision that reflected their commitment to putting family first. Emma sat at her vanity, watching in the mirror as Catherine helped Lily practice walking with her flower basket. The little girl was already dressed in her pale blue dress, a tiny flower crown sitting slightly askew on her dark curls. "Mama pretty," Lily declared, abandoning her practice to climb into Emma's lap. She reached for the simple pearl necklace laid out on the vanity, a gift from Catherine that morning. "Careful, sweetheart," Emma cautioned, helping her daughter. "Touch the pearls gently. These are special, just like today is special." In the adjoining room, they could hear Alexander and Lucas engaged in what sounded like serious negotiations about bow tie wearing. Lucas had recently developed a strong opinion about neckwear, insisting on untying anything placed around his neck. "Nobody," Alexander's patient voice carried through. "We need to keep this one tied. Look, Daddy's wearing one too." Emma's heart warmed at the word Daddy. It had emerged naturally from the twins a few weeks ago, and Alexander's joy had been palpable. He had called her immediately after the first time, his voice thick with emotion as he described Lucas pointing to him and saying "Dada" while reaching for a book. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her own pale blue dress matching her role as matron of honor and favorite aunt. "The photographer's here. Ready to start capturing some moments?" Emma looked at herself in the mirror one last time. Her dress was simple but elegant, an ivory sheath that spoke of new beginnings rather than traditional bridal expectations. Her hair was styled simply, with small white flowers woven through it. "Almost," she smiled, helping Lily down. "Just need to finish one thing." She opened a small box on her dresser, revealing the tiny necklaces Alexander had made for the twins. Each held a miniature ring, symbols of their unique family bond. "Pretty," Lily exclaimed as Emma fastened the delicate chain around her neck. The ring settled perfectly against her chest, catching the light as she moved. Lucas appeared in the doorway then, his bow tie miraculously still in place, Alexander right behind him. "Mama," he said seriously, "tie stays." "Good job, sweetheart," Emma praised, kneeling carefully in her dress to put his necklace on as well. Lucas touched the ring with gentle fingers, looking up at Alexander with a smile that showed he understood this was important. The photographer captured these moments quietly. The way Alexander's eyes softened watching Emma with the twins, the natural way they moved together as a family, the joy evident in every interaction. "The judge is here," Catherine announced. Softly, not wanting to break the moment but aware of their timeline. They had chosen a family court judge for the ceremony, the same one who had granted Emma custody, completing their journey from legal battles to celebration. The living room had been transformed. Simple white flowers and pale blue ribbons created an intimate ceremony space, with the city skyline as their backdrop through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A small string quartet, another of Catherine's touches, played softly in the corner. Their few guests were already seated, trusted friends who had supported them through everything, along with a surprise addition. Robert Pierce sat quietly in the back row, his presence a peace offering that Alexander had chosen to accept. The ceremony began with the twins' grand entrance. Lucas took his role as ring-bearer seriously, walking carefully down the aisle with the pillow holding the real rings. Lily followed, her flower basket empty before she reached the halfway point, but her joy in the moment infectious. Then it was Emma's turn. As she walked toward Alexander, she remembered another walk they'd taken together, climbing the courthouse steps, facing the cameras and Morrison's accusations. How far they'd come from that day, from the night by the railroad tracks, from all the moments of fear and uncertainty. Alexander's eyes never left her face as she approached. This wasn't the controlled, powerful CEO she'd first met in the hospital. This was the man who read bedtime stories with different voices, who knew exactly how each twin liked their breakfast, who had chosen love over power and never looked back. The judge spoke about choices, how love isn't just a feeling, but a daily decision to put someone else's freedom and happiness equal to your own. As they exchanged rings, their words were simple but profound. "I choose you," Alexander said, sliding the ring onto Emma's finger. "I choose our family, our freedom, our future together. Every day, in every way, I choose us." Emma's voice was steady as she repeated the words, the platinum band cool against Alexander's skin, but warming quickly, like their love had warmed his once-controlled heart. The twins were remarkably quiet during the ceremony, seeming to understand the importance of the moment. Lily stood holding Catherine's hand, occasionally touching her new necklace, while Lucas leaned against his aunt's legs, watching his parents, with serious eyes. "By the power vested in me," the judge concluded with a warm smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Their kiss was sweet and sure, a promise of all the days to come. It was broken by Lily's excited clapping and Lucas's declaration of "my turn," making everyone laugh as he demanded kisses too. The small reception that followed was everything they had wanted: intimate, joyful, free from pretense or performance. The twins danced with everyone, their energy seemingly endless. Catherine gave a toast that made both Emma and Alexander tear up, speaking about the transformation of her brother and the blessing of their unconventional family. Even Robert Pierce had a moment with his son, awkwardly but sincerely expressing his admiration for the man Alexander had become. It wasn't complete reconciliation, but it was a start. As the afternoon turned to evening, Emma and Alexander found themselves on their balcony, watching the sunset while the twins napped inside, worn out from their excitement. "Happy?" Alexander asked, though he knew the answer. Emma touched her ring, then the matching one that hung around Lily's neck. "Beyond happy," she replied. "Free." 3 months after the wedding, the Pierce Family Foundation had become a beacon of hope for families seeking freedom from controlling situations. Emma sat in their newly opened office space, reviewing applications for their first round of assistance programs, while the twins played in the carefully designed children's corner nearby. The foundation's headquarters occupied a bright, welcoming floor in a building far from the corporate towers where Alexander had once worked. Instead of imposing marble and chrome, the space featured warm colors and comfortable furnishings. A sign in the reception area read, "Freedom through support," their mission statement deliberately chosen to emphasize empowerment over rescue. "Mrs. Pierce," their receptionist appeared at the door. "Your 2 o'clock is here. The Thompson Soul." Family. Emma smiled at the name she was still getting used to, not because she had to take it, but because she had chosen to share it. "Send them in, please. And could you ask Catherine to join us when she's free?" A young mother entered, holding the hand of a small boy about the twins' age. Emma recognized the look in her eyes, the mixture of hope and fear she had once seen in her own mirror. "I'm Sarah," the woman said softly. "Sarah Thompson. No relation," she added with a nervous laugh. "I saw your interview. Your story. Mama! Lily's voice interrupted as she toddled over, proudly showing off her latest artwork. A crayon masterpiece that might have been a butterfly or possibly a rocket ship. Instead of apologizing for the interruption, Emma smiled and introduced her daughter. This is Lily, and that's her brother Lucas over there, conducting what appears to be a very serious conversation with his stuffed elephant. The tension in Sarah's shoulders eased slightly as her own son perked up at the sight of potential playmates. This is Michael, she said. We. Why don't we let the children play while we talk? Emma suggested, gesturing to the play area. It's completely visible from here, and our childcare specialist is right there. As Michael cautiously joined the twins, Sarah began to share her story. Like Emma, she had found herself gradually isolated by a controlling partner. Like Emma, she had struggled to find support when she tried to leave. The shelters are all full, she explained, twisting her hands in her lap. And Mark, he has connections. Everywhere I try to go, somehow he finds out. Catherine joined them then, her legal pad ready, but her approach gentle. That's why we're here, Sarah, to provide options that don't appear in any system he can access. They explained the Foundation's programs: secure housing through a network of private properties, job training, legal support, and most importantly, a community of survivors who understood the journey. We don't just offer shelter, Emma explained, watching as Michael laughed at something Lucas had done. We offer a chance to rebuild, to rediscover who you are without someone else controlling your narrative. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I've tried so many times to leave, but the system, it's like it's designed to keep us trapped. That's why we're changing it, Alexander's voice came from the doorway. He entered quietly, immediately drawing happy squeals from the twins, but waiting to greet them until the conversation was finished. Our foundation doesn't just help individuals, he continued, sitting beside Emma. We're working to change the legal framework that makes it so hard to escape controlling situations. Catherine's legal team is drafting legislation to address the gaps in the system. Sarah looked between them, seeing not the powerful ex-CEO and his wife, but two people who understood. How do you do it? She asked Emma. How did you find the strength to keep fighting? Emma reached for Alexander's hand naturally, by realizing that strength isn't about being untouchable. It's about being brave enough to let the right people in. She nodded toward the children playing. Look at Michael. He's already found his brave. Indeed, the little boy was showing Lily and Lucas how to build a taller tower with blocks, his earlier shyness forgotten in the joy of play. We can help you, Sarah, Catherine added. Not by controlling your choices, but by giving you the resources to make your own. As they worked out the details of Sarah and Michael's entry into their program, Emma watched the children play. Lily had appointed herself Michael's official tour guide of the play area, while Lucas shared his precious elephant with the new friend, a gesture of acceptance that spoke volumes. Later that evening, after Sarah and Michael had been settled into one of their secure properties, the family gathered in their penthouse. The twins were extra excited from their new friendship, turning their usual bedtime routine into a more elaborate production than usual. Story about Michael, Lily demanded, clutching her favorite book. Yeah, friend, Lucas agreed, his elephant still in its honored position by his pillow. Emma and Alexander exchanged glances, understanding their children's instinctive empathy for their new friends. As they began their usual story time, adapting their familiar tale to include themes of friendship and helping others, Emma felt a deep sense of rightness. They had transformed their own story of escape and healing into a foundation of hope for others. The twins, not yet 3 years old, were already learning the value of kindness and understanding, and Alexander, once driven by control and power, now used his resources to help others find their freedom. More families tomorrow? Lucas asked sleepily as they finished the story. Yes, sweetheart, Emma promised. More families tomorrow. As they tucked the twins in, their tiny rings glinting on their necklaces in the soft nightlight, Emma thought about all the other children out there, all the families seeking their own path to freedom. The foundation was more than their way of giving back. It was their way of ensuring that their story of love and transformation could help write new chapters for others. On a crisp autumn evening 1 year after their wedding, Emma and Alexander stood at the site where their story began, the railroad crossing where he had found her and the twins that fateful night. The place had been transformed, where there had once been abandoned warehouses. A new building stood, its warm lights glowing against the darkening sky. The Pierce Family Center. Emma read the sign softly, squeezing Alexander's hand. It feels right, doesn't it? Turning the place where we found freedom into a space where others can find theirs. The center was their foundation's flagship location, a comprehensive support facility offering everything from emergency housing to job training, childcare to legal services. But unlike traditional shelters, it was designed to feel like a home, a place where families could heal and grow stronger together. Inside, the grand opening celebration was in full swing. The twins, now 3 years old, were holding court in the children's area they had helped design, insisting that the reading nook needed lots of elephants and that every child should have their own special place to keep treasures. "Daddy, show pictures," Lily called out when she spotted them entering. She was referring to the photo wall, a carefully curated collection of images telling stories of transformation and hope. Alexander lifted her up so she could point to her favorites. "That's Michael," she announced proudly, indicating a photo of their first success story. Sarah Thompson and her son had not only found safety through their program, but had become part of the Foundation's support network, helping other families navigate their journeys to freedom. Lucas joined them, pulling Catherine along. "Show Aunt Cat the special door," he insisted. The special door was his name for the secure entrance system Catherine had designed, state-of-the-art protection disguised as welcoming architecture. The celebration brought together an unlikely community. Former business associates who had chosen to support Alexander's new mission mingled with survivors who had found their strength through the Foundation's programs. Robert Pierce stood awkwardly but proudly in a corner, watching his son and grandchildren with evident emotion. "Remember what you said to me in the hospital?" Emma asked Alexander as they watched their family and community interact, "about having the resources to help." He nodded, remembering his first instinct to solve problems with money and power. "I had no idea what real help looked like then, and now we're teaching others." Emma smiled as she watched Sarah Thompson guide a newly arrived mother through the registration process, her own son showing the woman's children where to find the best toys. Catherine clinked a glass, gathering everyone's attention. "A year ago," she began, "my brother and sister-in-law made their wedding vows in front of a small group of family and friends. Today they're renewing those vows in a different way, by opening this center as a promise to help other families find their own paths to freedom." The twins, understanding this was an important moment, returned to their parents' sides. Lily reached up to touch her necklace where her special ring hung, a gesture she often made when feeling emotional. "The Pierce Family Center," Catherine continued, "isn't just a building. It's a testament to what can happen when we choose love over control, community over power, and freedom over fear." As if to demonstrate this philosophy, Lucas spontaneously hugged a small girl who had arrived that morning with her mother, sharing his beloved elephant with her. The simple gesture of kindness brought tears to many eyes. But perhaps, Catherine smiled, the best way to understand what this place means is to hear from those who have found their new beginnings here. One by one, families stood to share their stories. Sarah Thompson spoke about finding not just safety, but purpose. A teenage girl described discovering her voice in the center's art therapy program. A father talked about learning to break the cycle of control he had inherited from his own family. As the stories continued, Emma felt Lucas tugging at her dress. "Mama," he whispered loudly, "can we tell our story too?" Emma lifted him into her arms, while Alexander did the same with Lily. "We tell our story every day, sweetheart," she explained. "Every time we help another family, every time we share our home and hearts, we're telling our story." The evening wound down with an impromptu dance party, the twins' contribution to the celebration. As families twirled and laughed together, Emma and Alexander found themselves back on the center's front steps, looking out at the railroad tracks that had brought them together. A lot has changed since that night, Alexander mused, watching a train pass peacefully in the distance. And a lot hasn't, Emma replied. The important things, love, family, freedom, they've only grown stronger. Inside, they could hear Lily teaching her new friends her special twirl, while Lucas solemnly distributed his stuffed animals to any child who seemed in need of comfort. Catherine was explaining the center's legal services to a group of interested mothers. Her passion for justice now focused on prevention rather than corporate law. "You know what I think," Emma said softly. "That night by the tracks, I always thought you saved us, but standing here now seeing all of this," she gestured at the center, at the community gathering inside, at their children spreading joy in their own unique ways. "I think we all saved each other." Alexander pulled her close, understanding exactly what she meant. They had all been trapped, in their own ways. Him by his father's legacy of control, her by James's manipulation, even Catherine by the corporate world's cold expectations. In choosing love, in choosing freedom, they had found not just safety but purpose. The Pierce Family Center stood as a beacon of that purpose, its warm lights pushing back the darkness, its doors open to those seeking their own paths to freedom. And inside, a community grew stronger, proving that the greatest power isn't in control or wealth or influence, but in the simple choice to love freely and help others do the same. "More stories tomorrow?" Lucas asked, as they gathered their family. To head home, his eyes heavy with happy exhaustion. "Yes, my sweet boy," Emma promised, sharing a smile with Alexander. "Many more stories tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that." 2 years after the opening of the Pierce Family Center, its impact had rippled far beyond their initial hopes. Emma sat in her office, reviewing the latest statistics. Over 300 families helped, 15 new centers opened across the country, and a growing network of survivors turned advocates. The sound of children's laughter drifted in from the playground, a sound that never failed to make her smile. Through her window, she could see Lily and Lucas, now 4 years old, leading a group of children in what appeared to be an elaborate game of their own invention. "They're natural leaders," Catherine observed, entering with a stack of papers. "Just like their parents." Emma watched as Lucas helped a smaller child navigate the climbing frame, while Lily organized what looked like a theatrical performance using the playground equipment as a stage. "They're natural healers," Emma corrected gently. "They understand somehow that every child who comes here needs something different, just like Alexander understood what I needed that night." Catherine settled into a chair, spreading out the papers between them. "Speaking of healing, the new legislation is gaining traction. 5 more states have adopted our proposed reforms for protective orders and shelter funding. The legislation, dubbed the Freedom to Thrive Act, had been born from their experiences with the system's failures. It addressed the gaps that often trapped families in controlling situations, from financial barriers to legal loopholes. Sarah's testimony made a huge difference, Emma noted, referring to their first success story. Sarah Thompson had become a powerful advocate, speaking before state legislatures about the importance of comprehensive support for families seeking freedom. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the playground. They looked up to see Alexander had arrived, immediately mobbed by not just their twins but several other children who had come to see him as a protector figure. "Story time," Lily announced loudly, a declaration that was met with enthusiastic agreement from her audience. Emma and Catherine watched as Alexander settled onto a playground bench, children gathering around him eagerly. This had become a tradition. His visits always included a story, usually one that helped the children understand their own situations in age-appropriate ways. "Once upon a time," his voice carried through the window, "there was a family of birds living in a cage. The cage looked beautiful, all gold and shiny, but it was still a cage." Emma recognized the story, one they had developed together to help children process their experiences. In this version, the birds learned that real beauty came from being free to fly, and that helping other birds find their freedom made the sky more beautiful for everyone. "He's come so far from the man who thought control was power," Catherine observed, watching her brother interact with the children. "Sometimes, I can hardly believe he's the same person who used to calculate every business decision to 2 decimal places." Emma smiled, remembering the controlled CEO she'd first met in the hospital. "He didn't change who he was, he just found a better way to use his gifts. That attention to detail now goes into making sure every family gets exactly the support they need." The playground story concluded with the children acting out the birds' flight to freedom, running with arms spread wide, their laughter echoing against the center's walls. Lucas and Lily led the celebration, having heard the story enough times to know all the best moments for dramatic effect. "Mrs. Pierce," their assistant appeared at the door. "The new family has arrived?" Emma stood, straightening her jacket. "Catherine, would you—" "Already on it," Catherine replied, gathering the children for their afternoon activities. "You and Alexander take care of the intake." As Emma headed to the reception area, she saw Alexander already there, kneeling to eye level with a young boy who clutched a worn teddy bear. The boy's mother stood nearby, showing the same mixture of fear and hope Emma remembered feeling herself. "Welcome to the Pierce Family Center," Emma said warmly, extending her hand. "Let's talk about your new beginning." Spring brought new life to the Pierce Family Center's garden, a project that had started as therapy for traumatized children and grown into a symbol of renewal. Emma walked among the raised beds where families tended their own small plots, teaching their children about growth and patience. Lily had become the unofficial garden supervisor, taking her role very seriously. She moved from plot to plot, offering encouragement and wisdom beyond her years. "Seeds need love to grow," she explained to a newly arrived boy, "just like people." Lucas, meanwhile, had developed a particular interest in the butterfly garden, carefully maintaining the plants that attracted them. "They're free now," he often told visitors, "like us." Alexander found them there one afternoon, both children dirt-smudged and happy, helping younger kids plant sunflower seeds. The sight still caught his heart. These precious children who had once been abandoned on railroad tracks now blooming into compassionate, confident individuals. "Daddy!" Lily called out, running to him with a handful of seeds. "We're planting hope!" It was her name for the sunflowers, hope flowers, because they always turned their faces to the light. The metaphor wasn't lost on any of the adults who worked at the center. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Emma asked as she joined them, brushing soil from her hands. Tomorrow was a significant day, the groundbreaking ceremony for their newest project. The Pierce Foundation had purchased the building where James Morrison's foundation had once operated, transforming it into a training center for survivors becoming advocates. "All set," Alexander confirmed, lifting Lucas, who had come to show him a particularly interesting butterfly. "Sarah's giving the keynote speech, and 5 more survivors have signed up for the advocacy program." The advocacy program had been Emma's idea, training former victims to become mentors and supporters for others. It created a network of understanding that went beyond professional services, offering peer support from those who truly understood the journey. "And the documentary team?" Emma asked, referring to the film crew that had been following their work for the past few months. "They'll be there. Catherine's handling the media arrangements." Alexander set Lucas down as the butterfly finally caught his attention. "She's made sure they understand our ground rules about protecting families' privacy." The documentary had been a difficult decision. They had always been protective of their community's privacy, but they also recognized the power of sharing these stories of transformation. The film would focus on the Foundation's work while respecting the confidentiality of those they helped. "Tell story?" Lucas asked, a request that had become his standard response to any mention of sharing experiences. They settled onto a garden bench, children naturally gathering around them as they always did when story time began. This had become their way of helping the youngest victims process their experiences through stories of butterflies finding their wings, birds discovering freedom, and flowers turning toward the light. Once upon a time, Emma began picking up Lucas's theme, there was a little caterpillar who lived in a garden much like this one. As she wove the tale, Alexander watched the children's faces. Some were new to the center, still carrying the shadows of their past experiences. Others, like the twins, had found their light and now helped guide others toward it. Sarah Thompson arrived during the story, her son Michael now a confident first grader who immediately joined the group. She caught Alexander's eye, gesturing toward the center's entrance where another family was arriving, their newest residents beginning their journey to freedom. This was how it worked now. A continuous cycle of healing and helping, of receiving support and giving it back. The garden was a perfect metaphor for their mission, a place where growth was nurtured, where new life emerged from difficult soil, where hope bloomed in unexpected places. Later, as they prepared to head home, Lily insisted on gathering a small bouquet of hope flowers for the new family. Lucas added a carefully drawn picture of butterflies, complete with a story about transformation that he had created himself. "They get it, don't they?" Emma said softly, watching their children welcome the newcomers with such natural grace. "The importance of what we're doing here." Alexander wrapped an arm around her shoulders, remembering the controlled, isolated man he had been before finding them. "They understand better than we did at first. They've never seen freedom as the absence of connection. They know it's about having the right connections, the ones that help you grow." The garden continued to buzz with activity around them. Families planting, children playing, butterflies, dancing on the breeze. Tomorrow would bring new challenges with the training center opening, but for now they could simply appreciate the growth happening before their eyes. "More hope tomorrow," Lily declared, with the certainty of a child who had never known her parents' doubts about the future. She pressed another sunflower seed into her father's hand. "For the new garden." Alexander pocketed the seed carefully, knowing it would find its place in the new center's garden. Every new location they opened included a garden now, a place where healing could take root and hope could grow toward the light. 3 years to the day after their wedding, Emma and Alexander stood in the auditorium of their newest facility, watching as the first class of advocacy trainees received their certifications. The room buzzed with energy. Survivors turned. Supporters, ready to help others find their path to freedom. Sarah Thompson, now the program's lead trainer, called each graduate by name. "These aren't just certificates," she explained to the audience. "They're promises. Promises to be the support we wished we had when we were searching for our way out." In the front row, Lucas and Lily sat with Catherine, their faces beaming with pride. At 5 years old, they had become unofficial mascots of the foundation, embodying its message of hope and transformation. "Remember when you found us?" Lily had asked that morning as they prepared for the ceremony. "Were you scared, Daddy?" Alexander had pulled her close, sharing a look with Emma over their daughter's head. "Not scared," he'd answered truthfully. "For the first time in my life, I was absolutely certain about what I needed to do." Now, watching the graduates receive their certificates, Emma reflected on how that certainty had rippled outward, touching hundreds of lives. The foundation had grown beyond their initial vision, becoming a movement that was changing how society approached family support and protection. The ceremony concluded with a surprise announcement from Catherine. "The Freedom to Thrive Act," she revealed, has just been passed at the federal level. Starting next year, every state will be required to implement comprehensive support programs for families seeking escape from controlling situations. The applause was thunderous, but it was the tears in many eyes that told the real story. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was validation of their shared experiences and a promise of better support for those still struggling to break free. Later, during the reception, Lucas tugged at Alexander's sleeve. "Can I tell them about the butterflies?" he asked, referring to his favorite story about transformation. Alexander lifted him onto a chair so he could address the room. With the natural confidence of a child who had always known he was loved, Lucas shared his simple but profound wisdom about change and freedom. "Butterflies look scary when they're changing," he explained to the attentive audience, "but they have to break the cocoon themselves, or they won't be strong enough to fly." Emma felt tears prick her eyes as their son continued. "That's what Mama and Daddy do. They help people find their wings, but they let them do the flying themselves. Lily, not to be outdone, added her own perspective. "And we help the new kids feel safe," she declared proudly, "because everybody needs a friend when they're learning to fly." The graduates responded with emotional applause, many of them having watched the twins grow up alongside their own children in the Foundation's programs. These kids were living proof that trauma didn't have to define a family's future. Sarah approached Emma during the celebrations, Michael, now a confident 7-year-old, by her side. "You know what I realized today," she said softly. "When I first came to the Foundation, I thought I was just looking for safety. But what I found, what we all found, was purpose." Emma watched as Michael joined Lucas and Lily in showing newer children around the facility. The three of them had developed a special bond, united by their shared experience of finding freedom through their parents' courage. "That's the real transformation," Alexander added, joining them. "Not just escaping control, but discovering who you can become when you're free to choose your own path." Catherine arrived with more news from Washington. Additional funding had been approved for support programs nationwide. "They're using our model," she reported proudly. "The Pierce Foundation's approach is becoming the standard for family support services." As the evening wound down, the family gathered in what had become their tradition, a quiet moment together before heading home. The twins were tired but happy, their natural empathy having led them to spend the day comforting nervous children and celebrating with graduating families. "Did we do good?" Lily asked sleepily as Alexander carried her to the car. "We did very good," Emma assured her, helping Lucas with his coat. "And tomorrow we'll do more good." "More stories?" Lucas asked hopefully. "Always more stories," Alexander promised, "because every family that finds their freedom has a new story to tell." They drove home through the city they had helped transform. The Pierce family centers were now landmarks of hope, their warm lights burning in the darkness like beacons guiding people home. The railroad tracks where their story began had become a symbol of new beginnings rather than desperate choices. Emma reached for Alexander's hand as they drove, their sleeping children in the back seat, their shared legacy of love growing stronger with each family they helped. They had discovered that true power wasn't in controlling others, but in empowering them to find their own strength. And in the back seat around the twins' necks, their special rings still hung, symbols of a family built on choice rather than obligation, on freedom rather than control, on love that grew stronger with every heart it touched. 5 years after that fateful night by the railroad tracks, the Pierce family gathered at their original center for a special celebration. The occasion wasn't just the anniversary of their foundation, it was a celebration of every family who had found their path to freedom through their doors. The center's garden, now a lush oasis in the heart of the city, was filled with families sharing stories of transformation. Lily and Lucas, wise beyond their 6 years, moved through the crowd with the ease of children who had grown up understanding the importance of making others feel welcome. "Look, Mama!" Lily called out, pointing to the butterfly garden Lucas had helped design. A newly emerged monarch was drying its wings in the sunlight, its transformation complete. "Another one ready to fly." Emma watched as her children gathered other kids to witness the moment, their excitement infectious. Lucas, ever the storyteller, was already weaving a tale about the butterfly's journey, while Lily organized the younger children into a gentle audience. Alexander joined them, wrapping an arm around Emma's waist. "Remember when we thought we were just opening a shelter?" he mused, watching the scene before them. The Pierce Foundation had become so much more than that. Beyond the physical centers and support programs, they had created a movement, a new way of understanding family support that focused on empowerment rather than just protection. Sarah Thompson, now the Foundation's program director, approached with news from their latest initiative. "The mentorship program has exceeded all expectations," she reported. 97% of families who work with a survivor mentor successfully transition to independent living. Catherine arrived with more updates from their legal team. The Freedom to Thrive Act had inspired similar legislation internationally, and delegations from several countries had visited to study their model. "But the real success," Emma said softly, "is in the small moments." She gestured to where Lucas was showing a newly arrived boy his favorite reading spot, while Lily helped another child plant her first sunflower seed. These simple acts of kindness, multiplied across all their centers, created ripples of healing that would continue for generations. "Tell us the story, Daddy," Lily called out, running to Alexander with a group of children trailing behind her. "Tell us how it all began." The families gathered around as Alexander lifted Lily onto his lap, Lucas settling beside them with his ever-present elephant tucked under his arm. It was a story they had heard many times, but one that never lost its power. "Once upon a time," Alexander began, his voice carrying across the garden, "there was a man who thought he had everything, but his heart was locked in a cage of his own making. Then one night, by some railroad tracks, he found something that would change his life forever." As he told their story, Emma looked around at the community they had built. Robert Pierce sat quietly in the back, a changed man who now volunteered at the center's financial literacy program. Catherine had found her true calling in advocacy law, her sharp mind now focused on changing systems instead of navigating them. The children listened intently, even those who knew the story by heart. When Alexander reached the part about the twins being found, Lily and Lucas sat a little straighter, proud of their role in the Foundation's origin story. "But the real magic," Alexander continued, "wasn't in the rescue. It was in what happened next, how love broke down walls, how freedom replaced control, and how one family's journey became a path for others to follow." As the story concluded, the butterfly they had watched earlier took flight, its wings now strong enough to carry it skyward. The children gasped in delight, seeing in its flight a symbol of their own journeys toward freedom. "That's what we do here," Emma added, addressing the gathered families. "We help each other find our wings, support each other as we learn to fly, and celebrate every successful flight." The celebration continued into the evening, with more stories shared, more connections made, more hope planted like seeds in fertile soil. The Pierce family centers had become more than safe houses. They were incubators of transformation, where broken spirits healed and new beginnings took root. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the garden, Lily and Lucas helped light the lanterns they had crafted with other children, each one representing a family's journey from darkness to light. "More stories tomorrow?" Lucas asked, a question that had become both tradition and promise. "Yes, sweetheart," Emma assured, him drawing both twins close. "There will always be more stories tomorrow." Alexander looked at his family, at the community they had built, at the legacy of love that would continue long after them. "And each story," he added, "becomes part of something bigger, a reminder that when we choose love over fear, freedom over control, and hope over despair, we create ripples that touch countless lives." The lanterns glowed in the gathering dusk, each light a beacon of hope, each family a testament to the power of transformation, each story a thread in the tapestry of healing they had woven together.